thank you very much, anyone watching, and thanks a lot to Matt Colquhoun to agree for this interview. We are really honored to have you here and to be able to ask you some questions. Well, first of all, I would like to introduce you a little bit to Matt. He's a photographer and an author and blogger. He has published actually in his blog Xenogothic consistently for the last year. He edited and helped and actually introduced the volume Post-Capitalist Desire, which included the last lecture of Mark Fisher, and he wrote and published Egreso, on Mourning, Melancholy, and Mark Fisher, which is it's a book that I think is difficult to define or to make like a synthesis about. I guess it's some sort of journal you kept after Fisher's death about the reaction of the community at Warwick about after that loss, but also it morphs into some really interesting commentary of Mark's work and legacy and in general of popular culture and themes that he worked. And you could, I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but it's probably is the first book about Mark Fisher ever published, right? Or one of the first ones.
Yeah.
So the book is coming to the Spanish-speaking world. It's going to be published in Spain. We don't know exactly the moment, but with the date. But we hope there's going to be around January 2022. So given that, let's begin with the interview. And thanks a lot, Matt. First of all, how are you doing? And thanks a lot for agreeing to the interview.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm all right. I guess we're sort of recording this towards the end of 2021, and yeah, the days are getting very dark here in the north of England. So it's nice to spend them talking to people rather than just reflecting on how grim it is outside. So yeah, nice to see you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so let's begin. So my first, actually wanted to start talking about publication of Egreso. Egreso was originally published just a few days before full lockdown was enacted in the UK. And though this might look like a bad timing, recent events seem to resonate eerily with the melancholic theme of the book. Its admittedly dark tone and subject seem to connect particularly well with today's social atmosphere. But one of the most illuminating elements of your book was your consideration of community and consciousness rising precisely in the context of mourning and despair. And given that, I'd like to know if you believe that the pandemic has affected the relevance and actuality of these themes in a good or in a bad way.
Yeah, it's a strange thing to think about now, because yeah, as you say, that we had the book launch for Egreso in London. I think it was about exactly a week before we locked down. There was a sense of not really knowing how bad the pandemic was. I don't know, it was a very confusing time. It's kind of strange to look back on now. I'd say personally, it definitely felt like the worst possible timing, if only because, I guess, as you say, it's a book that's very much about community. But actually to have it then come out in those circumstances was really isolating and alienating. It wasn't a pleasant experience. But I think that at the same time, I guess the egress of the book, the exit that it's trying to talk about, is essentially how to get out of the self, how to sort of plunge yourself into community. And the pandemic was essentially a complete setback in that any kind of project. But I think the pandemic has shown that it's forced everyone to sort of retreat inside themselves in a way. I think it's also shown how damaging our fixation on individualism really is. There's a sense that many people and even governments in general sort of place a higher emphasis on individual sovereignty than social responsibility, and that's probably more true in the UK than anywhere else, considering how we've handled things. But it's funny actually, because just today I finished reading another book that's coming out on Repeated Books here in the UK that was about humanitarian aid in the 1990s, in Somalia specifically. And the author has this argument in it where they're talking about how we live in an age where individual sovereignty is held higher than social responsibility, and that's deep rooted long before the pandemic. That kind of even the refugee crisis that we're seeing in the UK, in Europe rather more generally, and have done for quite a few years now. It's it's the same dynamics at play, where we care more about the sovereignty of an individual nation or of individual communities rather than highlighting that key communal aspects of our humanity. So yeah, it's interesting to think how the book sits in that now. But I suppose my feeling is at present that a little individualism isn't so bad. It's, I guess, as Mark would say it, the problem is like a mandatory individualism, the way that individualism is insisted upon when it's often not fit for purpose. And I think that's something that's shifted the tone of the book for me anyway. But I mean, it's still such an unfolding process. I'm not really sure where I sit with it at the moment. But yeah, it's interesting how it's changed it. It has changed the book a lot, I think. It's like we're in a new world almost.
Yeah, I would say so though. Okay, so the Spanish edition of Egreso seems like an obvious choice given the popularity that Mark is gaining in the Spanish-speaking world. As I can ascertain personally, this is especially starting in Spain and in the last year. This seems to be growing. There seems to be a growing interest in keeping and expanding Fisher legacy and work. And with the recent repurchase of Zero Books by Peter, both of which Fisher helped founding, his figure and influence seems to be expanding to more and more authors, groups, and initiatives that are explicitly influenced by him. Do you believe this as well? Like, are you detecting this? And if so, where do you see this phenomenon leading in the future?
Yeah, seeing just how much Mark's influence has kind of grown since his death is quite astounding, really. You kind of felt it immediately afterwards, and it's only grown. I mean, we're coming up to 5 years since Mark died, and the fact that it's only continuing to snowball, I don't think anyone really predicted or thought would happen. Not to say that he isn't deserved, I guess is the other thing. I think it's a really amazing thing to see. But I guess it's interesting because I often wonder what it is that about Mark's work that really resonates with people, both, I guess, across generations too. Because I think about someone, Mark's unfortunately not the only sort of person in like the sort of leftist Anglosphere that we've lost in recent years. I just received David Graeber has a new book that's just come out, a new posthumous book. And I remember his death really resonated with Mark's own. But then thinking about Mark in particular and what's resonated so much with him, with a much wider audience maybe, I think that maybe reflects his own sort of style of engagement. When you consider the fact that it's not just his influence on leftist culture, but popular culture more generally. So Mark's almost like someone like Forrest Gump or something. Like he as soon as you start looking back on these different pop cultural moments, Mark's there somewhere with some sort of thing to say and contribute. And then, even though he's not around anymore, there's so many vital slogans or catchphrases or arguments that you kind of hear people proliferate, even if they've not read his work. He's kind of just there now, at least in the UK. Maybe that's increasingly elsewhere as well. But I think that there's something to be said for how Mark was just had his finger on the pulse of the moment that he was in. I think maybe especially in the UK, I think he was maybe more known as a music writer than necessarily a political writer. And I think like projects like Burial or The Caretaker that I think is Mark's quite synonymous with. But a large part of how he became so influential, I think, is that he wasn't just talking about those kind of acts in like a critical theory sense. He was actively participating in like a pop cultural conversation. And it's interesting, I guess, how that carries over. I guess the one thing that I was thinking about was how, I mean, people, acts like the Burial and the Caretaker specifically, I guess they, for Mark, they, and a lot of other people, they signify a quite mournful and a quite melancholic cultural moment. And I think especially for my own generation, I mean, I'm 30 this year, and Mark basically defined a lot of my 20s and like late teens. And I think he defined a kind of millennial anxiety almost, quite specifically. So for my generation, he is like the hauntology guy. He's the guy that was talking about the cancellation of the future. But there's also the sense that, I think a lot of people don't necessarily go beyond that to look at his accelerationist writings, which I think, I mean, it's a politically contentious term, but I think what Mark found in that mode was like a kind of a new fury, a new militancy, a new political insistence that another world is possible, which I think you can see, at least I can see, or I recognize being really prevalent in, like, the Zoomers, the sort of younger generation. So I think if Mark's influence is going to continue, I think it's probably on those lines. He's got so much to say to a younger generation that's still finding its voice. Like, I think as much as he diagnosed the neuroses of my generation, he kind of saw the next generation coming and wrote a lot about that as well. So he's at least got another decade of speaking to, if not longer, I'm sure. But there's a whole generation just emerging that he's definitely got a huge resonance with.
Yeah, if I can add something about the contrast of that, I guess, reception of Fisher. Like here, I'd say that precisely musical, like I think Fisher is difficult to understand, like especially the totality of his work without more understanding of British particular national context and British music in general. So I would say that's precisely basically the elements that has not or have not translated very well here, which makes sense. But on the other hand, capitalist realism and his more political work has definitely found an audience. And I really like what you said about melancholy, and because here I think I maybe in the back end of millennials, but I still kind of like identify with that generation. And I think after like a decade of like really intense political and electoral activity here, there were a lot of people who came like for a moment that came into a moment like seeing this last decade as kind of like a lost opportunity or something like that. And I think Fisher can be, can relate to that feeling of loss of, he was kind of like this last prophet of this wave of labor and left movements that happened all over the world, but in Spain with especially with some particularities. But I totally agree that he seems to be resonated extremely well with future generations. We are, like, I personally am seeing, and that's maybe anecdotal, but a really strong acceptance from our younger audience here and from like kind of this I think there's a lot, like Zoomer generation can relate, like I think both generations can relate in this kind of despair feeling and this understanding that we need to make some different future possible, because that's like kind of like an only option in this moment.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because it's I mean, I was in Slovenia maybe a month or two ago, because they've just translated capitalist realism into Slovenian, and they had a book launch and I went to go and speak at it, and the audience there too was so young. It made me feel really old, but that's kind of surprising. It's not what I'd expect as being, for having read that book, a book that came out when I was 18, and then to still have 18-year-olds today read it is like it's crazy, really. It's I don't think there's many things that have that continued relevance for like a certain age group. It's great to see.
Yeah, and Okay, so we can pivot if you don't mind to popular culture, because this is an aspect I really want to touch on the book. Well, Egreso is a book that, much in the vein of Mark Fisher, doesn't back down on taking directly on popular culture. The book includes comments on the metrics, the OA, or Westworld, just to name a few. You have also engaged with multiple aspects of popular culture and media in your blog, and not always the most obvious ones, like the recent long post you wrote on Limp Bizkit last album, Out of Style. So this is maybe a question with two parts, so you can answer to any of those, or both if you like. What's the potential? Like, the first one would be, what's the potential you see and seek in popular culture or for theory and generally writing? And the second one would be, is there any piece of popular culture you've recently been interested in?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I will answer that in two parts, if only because I guess the mentioning the Matrix, the OA, and Westworld. I mean, the OA and the Westworld in particular do feature quite prominently in the book, but they oddly feel like they're part of like another world almost. But I guess that's where to start. I mean, I guess that theorizing. My interest in theorizing popular culture largely comes from Mark's own. But I think even beyond that, like, I just don't understand how anyone who isn't interested in like it's shifting tastes or the ideals of pop culture, like, even if you think it's shit, it's always like there's it's always got something to say. There's always looking at pop culture will always tell you something about the time that you're living in. And even if that's, you know, like coming from the ground up, or that's the latest like Marvel movies, even though it can be very easy to be cynical about these things, it can tell you either about, you know, what it is that is interesting us, maybe that we haven't yet managed to express, or even if there are these huge media conglomerates, like what is their perception of who we are right now and what we want. Limp Bizkit's probably a perfect example. I was personally a huge Limp Bizkit fan when they released like their Chocolate Starfish album, but I was also 9 years old, so don't hold it against me. But it's funny because there were years and years where I ignored the fact I'd ever liked them. When the kind of new metal moment was over. And then I think sort of more recently, when I started doing the xenogothic blog, I kind of tapped back into that knowledge. Like, I just had a pool of fans' knowledge at the back of my head about that band that I'd not really tapped into for a long time. But having that opportunity to kind of reflect on that moment politically, like, what was it like to be 9 years old in the year 2000? It was like quite interesting to sort of reflect on, and you know how that kind of has shaped that generation. Like, I think the Limp Bizkit particularly maybe like a pariah band now, but or even one that people maybe like ironically, but they were you couldn't escape them at that time. And other bands like Linkin Park and Papa Roach, like, I think they had a #1 single in the UK, which is quite bizarre to think about now. But, you know, what did that say? What did Papa Roach having a #1 single say about UK popular culture, youth culture even? And I guess that, I mean, I never got the chance to ask if Mark had any opinions on new metal, but I kind of talked to a lot of friends about this, because it's sort of clear that sort of stuff is not anything that Mark Fisher would, I'm sure, have any interest in talking about. But at the same time, I think you have to retain some fidelity to your own moment. Like, you know, it's interesting to read someone like Mark Fisher, who's like a product of post-punk, which I think is a culturally really rich time to, you know, talk about the music and the politics that came out of that moment. But then what is it and I just sort of think, what is it for me as a product of postmodern weirdness? Like, which isn't really probably respected in any way whatsoever, but, you know, nonetheless still a product of that moment. And I think, I mean, when Mark writes about popular culture, when I try and write about popular culture, there is this long tail of kind of like a UK tradition of like cultural studies, So Mark would be influenced by people like Raymond Williams or Stuart Hall. And these are essentially Marxist academics that just took popular culture really seriously. So Raymond Williams is a great example. He's really famous for this theory of structures of feeling. On the one hand, it's quite like it's a familiar concept, probably. It's like a Marxist idea of historical materialism. The material conditions that you grew up in shape your ideas. So I think Williams maybe applies that idea to popular culture. How does pop culture shape what you think and how you think? And even how, what feelings are being expressed, feelings that actually might not become theoretical, they might not be flying. That pop culture often expresses things that we haven't put into words yet. At least not, academically, that we can sort of, it's these things are always done with the benefit of hindsight, I suppose is the point. It's very easy. It's easier now to be in 2021 and talk about sort of with a distance what a band like Limp Bizkit means. But I think the more interesting question is like kind of the point of the post. What do they mean now? What is that album coming out now? Not what does it remind us of from the 2000s? What does that tell us about 2021? That's kind of a far more and always a more interesting question of how you can kind of respond to the particular conditions of the present. I think that's what a lot of cultural studies stuff does. Stuart Hall's kind of another perfect example, I suppose. He comes from a similar position. I think his idea of culture, and he would sort of argue that it was all culture, not just high or classical art that was kind of regarded as culture by academia, but all culture is, and this is a quote he sort of says, was experience lived, experience interpreted, experience defined. And I think that as an approach to culture just means that, pop culture is essential. If you're not thinking and talking about pop culture, you can't deal with the present. Whether your interest is political, scientific, or otherwise, like pop culture is always going to have an impact on what you do. Which is quite a ramble. I guess the one thing I wanted to say about talking about the OA, for instance, then, or Westworld or the Matrix, they were interesting to me in writing Egress because they essentially dealt with death, and a lot of TV at that time dealt with death. And I guess we were dealing with death quite literally with Mark's death, but also sort of more broadly, there was a lot of violence in sort of that year. We had I think another thing that's kind of key to the book, at least in my mind, is the Grenfell Tower fire that happened in London that year, when I think 70 people died from in a working class community because of government and private corporate negligence. And so there was this need, I think, to see that reflected in pop culture at the time was kind of interesting. But in one sense, these shows they're not really saying anything new. They're about notions of escape, but also sustained escape. They're about issues of ideology, hegemony, resistance to hegemony or drudgery or injustice. So they're kind of almost like retellings of like Plato's allegory of the cave. You can go that far back. The story's got it's the same sort of structure. It's the same questions being asked, but I guess it's how that story is being retold sort of says a lot. So you can go to, Plato's allegory is about enlightenment. It's like the literal enlightenment of stepping out of the cave into the light, and how that can be disorientating and blinding experience. Then you take a film like John Carpenter's They Live, for example, which like Slavoj Žižek's kind of famously analyzed to death. You kind of have the opposite there. It's not about stepping out into the light. You're putting sunglasses on. It's kind of actually about blocking some of the light that you're seeing. It's blocking out some of the sort of semiotic blitz of like capitalism and seeing sort of what's behind the noise. The Matrix is, you have this sense of it being about waking up. You have to wake up rather than step outside of something. You have to wake up from a dream, essentially. And then when you get to like the Westworld, or especially the OA, it's less about this dichotomy between being awake or being asleep. And I guess that's still a prevalent dichotomy today. We have this idea of wokeness or woke culture that the right loves to attack, an age-old dichotomy between being awake and being asleep. But in 2017 with the OA, it was made a bit more serious. It was between being alive and being dead. It was a much more sort of striking and stark dichotomy at play. And I think that has a lot to do with kind of how we were talking about politics at that time. Mark would talk a lot about neoliberalism as being like a zombie ideology. It's not actually a living political project anymore, but still staggers on. So you kind of have to see that kind of political analysis reflected in popular culture in that kind of terms. Is really interesting. And I guess that's just the value of it in a way. I mean, it's interesting now that I don't think we're in that moment anymore. And I'm kind of interested to see how Spanish readers will respond to this text in a way, because just with the nature of the pandemic, I think some of the book does feel dated, or at least literally, it's literally in a time frame. And that was always intentional, but it's striking how a lot of those cultural references don't resonate anymore. But I think that's an interesting observation almost. It kind of suggests what has changed. I guess that's a long answer to your first question. I guess I have a short answer to the second one, but maybe they're kind of related too. Popular culture that I've been enjoying recently is still kind of along those lines. And I was kind of thinking about it earlier because there's this new Netflix series that, there's a Netflix series called Lock and Key. That my partner and I love it. We've like watched the first season maybe 3 times now, and I always feel a bit ashamed to say it because everyone I've recommended it to thinks it's awful. But I really like it. It's like a comfort watch.
I saw the first season and I didn't think it was awful. I want to see the second one, which is out now, right?
Yeah. Apparently it's better. And I mean, I think it is better. I just think it's I really like it as a show. I guess because it's quite, I mean, I know it's based on the comic book. I haven't read the comic book, but I only learned recently that the comic book's quite explicitly Lovecraftian. So it's like, oh, okay, well, that's why I like it. Because I'm saying, I mean, that's right up my street. But I think I like it because I think a lot of people see it as like a Stranger Things ripoff or an imitation. But what I like about it is that I guess it's a similar sort of process. It's similarly dealing with a group of kids who are becoming aware of power, both their own power and other people's. And the way that that's dramatized with literally they find a bunch of magical keys so they can unlock things in their minds. Like that's kind of, there's something quite Matrix about that. The way that you can awaken knowledge in yourself. But I think what I like about it is that it's very much now. It feels like it's dealing with, it's a kind of a predictable high school coming of age thing. But whereas like something like Stranger Things is so fixated on the past, it's fixated on this kind of solid idea of what it is to like a coming of age story. What I kind of like about Lock and Key is that it sort of updates that a bit. And it's not it's also not like the OA. It's not a bunch of melodramatic millennials like flailing in the face of death. Like I guess like the initial premise for the show is these kids go to their old family home after their father's killed. And the way that first season deals with grief, I think is really interesting. But actually a lot more joyful than something you would have got a few years ago. Like the way the OA deals with grief is pretty harrowing and pretty depressing, whereas I find a lot of joy in Lock and Key. And I guess the other thing that I always end up coming back to at the moment is the novels of Sally Rooney, which I don't know if how like much she's exploded around the rest of Europe. But
it has exploded like, incredibly in Spain. Like,
yeah, right. Okay, so yeah, I mean it's the same here. Everyone's obsessed, but it's kind of. Did you have the TV show as well? Like
yes. Like people are, for example, both my sisters have read the book, seen the TV show. Like I know a lot of like it's really famous here.
Great.
And their last book was like in Saint Launch here.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, it's interesting to know that it's not. I mean, I feel like we're such a bubble, especially post Brexit. We're like a weird bubble. I think I never want to assume anything we care about it resonates beyond our myopic sense of ourselves. But I think she's super interesting, if only because one of my favorite books is Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. Which is a book Mark hated. I always feel like I need to add that maybe people assume, I guess it's like the Limp Bizkit thing. To write about Mark, you have to share his cultural, I don't know, his tastes. I think we would have disagreed on a lot. But what I find really interesting about D.H. Lawrence is the way that, I mean, especially in the UK, like the Lady Chatterley's Lover was kind of famously banned for a very long time. You couldn't get access to it until, I think it was written in maybe the 30s or 40s, and then didn't come out until like it was unbanned in like 1968 or something, like late 60s. Precisely because it's just a book that's very explicitly about sex, but also politics and class. And what I've always found really interesting about that novel is that you can't really escape it. Since it was unbanned, I think there's been maybe like 24 different adaptations of it on like in film or on the TV. I think there was one on the BBC here just a few years ago. I think that Netflix is now making their own version of it. And what's always hilarious about that for me is that it's always made into like a kind of soft porn movie, but there's so much politics in that book that's always just completely skipped over. So in the TV films, there always this emphasis on intercourse rather than discourse. It's like all the emphasis on the sex scenes, but none of the after dinner debates of Bolshevism, which literally exists in the book. There's an amazing scene where this like all these rich men are in a smoking drawing room of this mansion, talking about the benefits of Bolshevism. And that never makes it into any script for an adaptation, which I just want to see that happen. But anyway, I think that what's interesting about Sally Rooney is that, especially Normal People, is like a book that's very similar. I think it deals with class politics and sexual politics in much the same way. But the adaptation of that book kind of seemed to have a similar issue with it almost. There was a lot of emphasis on the sex, less so on the class politics. And I think in the book, they're handled pretty evenly. And I just thought that's another like sort of pop cultural thing that I just kind of get a bit obsessed with, that we have come such a long way in terms of representations of the body and our relationships with one another, sort of sexual relationships, but we still get squeamish and sort of suppressed discussions of class. So I'm kind of, and I mean, her latest book seems to just carry on that thing, but I'm interested to see how, as her profile sort of explodes, I'm curious to where, if and when that balance will be restored, where there's sort of as much class politics as sexual politics. And it's definitely there. There's been an improvement from the Lady Chatterley's Lover days, but I think that especially the way that work's dealt with says a lot about us as well, in ways that I haven't necessarily seen discussed by a lot of people, but I think it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I would like to. I was thinking when you were talking about Lock and Key, if I may add, for example, like I also enjoy the series, and I see much of what you saw, but that also helps me, for example, to understand. I had like a recent obsession. Well, it's more than a year with this like new wave of summer horror comedy slasher movies, like. The Babysitter were the first ones. Then you have Fear Street this year, and this one with Vince Vaughn, Freaky, and all of them are really similar in the way that they get this like more like social, social left-leaning philosophy of acceptance and diversity. But also I think it has definitely an attitude towards death much more. I wouldn't say it's not the cynicism of like 90s horror, hyper ironic and hyper self-aware comedy, but it's also not like the nihilism, I think, for more depressive recent horror film. I don't know. I found it super engaging. This new wave of things that are actually having like a really strong connection with some political, like Fear Street is insane. I don't know if you've seen it, but the third movie,
Yeah,
it's
I really enjoyed it.
The way it ties in with the like American history and some class oppression and some race and gender. Like for me, it was like insane that this is the now the horror that is being targeted to young people, right? It's like
yeah.
But
I think it's there is some, I mean, that's like, I often, I mean, I assume that lots of these things were really made and planned to be made before the pandemic, but
yeah,
I do think, there's something there that I think we've collectively experienced so much death that it's sort of changed something in our relationship to it, that I think there is like a tonal shift, even in like the most horror movies that just are taking, I guess, joy in death, essentially. At least the comedic sort of gallows humor of it. But yeah, there's been some sort of tonal shift that I think is probably indicative of something a lot wider than just how we think about death, but I guess think about all sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, it's a great example. A really strange series of films that, there's I guess that's it. It's how peculiar they are. Surely is saying something to us that we just, I don't know how to put it into words, but that's why it's interesting. There's something resonant in there that we're probably going to unpack as the years go on.
Yeah, that's it. So again, in the same vein of popular culture, and actually now more about today, it was my next question. So a part of writing Egreso, you've also edited and prologue the volume Post-Capitalist Desire, which contains features, last and incomplete lectures. In the book, Mark seems to be working and developing with his students on the likely contents of his never concluded book, Acid Communism. This is a concept you touch and expand on the book, especially in one of my personal favorite chapters, in which you talk about the psychedelic nature of New Westerns and the frontier overall in American onto-political imagination. So with recent productions such as Warner Brothers' Dune, which is explicitly predicated on some kind of frontier and psychedelia, and Marvel's series Loki, an introduction of the multiverse, it seems that at least psychedelic narratives and aesthetics are gaining some kind of momentum in the cusp of popular culture. So I think it really connects with our last conversation. I don't know if you think there's anything positive to say about this apparent psychedelic resurgence, or is this still far apart for anything like throughout the openings? Or
yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you like that chapter because it's my favorite as well. I think I spent 6 solid months on it. And it's like, I was really unsure about including it because I have so much to say on this topic. I almost thought maybe I'd keep it back and use it in another book. And I think I'd still have to write a book about the psychedelic legacy of the American West because, I think it's fascinating. But I'm sort of a little bit behind on the times almost. I haven't seen Dune yet, though I'm excited to. I haven't seen Loki either, though I think I'm going to have to now you've mentioned it. I guess I suppose the Mandalorian is kind of another example. That's the last thing I can think of. Well, I mean, I feel like there's always westerns in production. Or there, I mean, the history. I'm gonna have to put my blinkers on because I'm gonna go off on the history of westerns in Hollywood. But I guess that sticking to that. I guess what we were just talking about. I suppose what is it about that? Especially the space western, I suppose, right? This kind of the Mandalorian always felt like I loved that show, if only because it felt like a classic old school serial western, but updated into the Star Wars universe. I mean, I'm more of a Trekkie personally, so that there was like Star Wars content that I really enjoyed is often kind of surprising for me. It's not my favorite, but I did really love it. But yeah, I wonder how much that relates to this kind of new, American billionaire's obsession with the space race. But again, I mean, I suppose the Star Trek thing is a good point. There's that famous Star Trek line about space being the final frontier. It's not a generic line. It's kind of it's a sentiment that's explicitly American. I think, like coming from JFK gave a famous speech, I think, about combining sort of Cold War rivalries and the space race with like a kind of make America great again thing of, if whoever gets to space first wins. And I guess it's that it's sort of it's I think what I like about the Western in general is that it reflects this kind of intensive relationship that America has with itself. And Mark's kind of got a great point on this actually, where I guess there's this one post that he wrote on when he was writing about psychedelia on his blog in like 2004. He has this moment where he talks about what intensity means in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. And his point is that, I don't know how the word translates into Spanish, but I think in a lot of ways when people say the word intense, I know I use it quite generally to say if I have, I have an intense experience, be like, whoa, that was intense. But I guess that there's this general sense that what that means is that you have a quite explosive but maybe short-lived experience that is a lot at once. And Mark kind of makes the point that for Deleuze, it's very much different. To be intense is to be in tension. And Mark kind of, it feels a bit gratuitous, but I think it's kind of a good metaphor. He talks about intensity, the different uses of the word intensity as being like male and female orgasms. So you have the idea of a male orgasm that's just explosive and short-lived, but the intensity of a female orgasm is like staying on a plateau. It's about staving off climax. It's about remaining in tension. It's not about giving into extremity, but kind of retaining a kind of emotional, affective friction of not wanting something to be over. And I kind of feel like the American West, in the kind of American imagination, is like that kind of female orgasm. It's like, and that's why America feels fixated on it. It's like its obsession with the West is like a kind of post-coital regret of like, because I guess that moment is the Wild West is kind of this moment of being in tension of South Americans, Native Americans, colonial Europeans, enslaved or maybe freed Africans. And I guess that when the frontier is closed, a lot of that tension dissipates and America kind of becomes reified into the monstrosity it is today. But the idea of keeping that in mind, it's not to say that the Wild West was kind of an attractive or desirable state of being. It seems like it was anarchy. But I think the main thing is that it was a space of intensive potential, that anything could happen, that history could go in any different direction. It was a kind of it's a space of indecision, and it wasn't sure what was going to happen. There was no idea maybe of what America was going to become. And I know Deleuze has this fixation on American literature, especially because that's the ideal, that kind of cultural ideal of trying to reacquire that experience of being in tension. Even though, I think that when America tries to get back to that, whether through imperialist projects or its sort of spacefaring fantasies, what it's looking for is the return of that raw potentiality. So how psychedelia relates to that, I think, is that it's tricky, but I think that was Mark saw psychedelia as kind of representing that same sort of potential, that it is a kind of being in tension with the world, with reality, that gives you a sense of that anything could happen, that you could literally change things. But I guess it's where I think one of the things that maybe Mark wrestled with was how you relate this very recognizable idea of psychedelia, this kind of 60s mode, to the psychedelia of a new digital age. So to kind of use the Western still as an example, like there's a lot of recent Westerns seem to focus not on being in the West as it was, but they focus on that moment when the West was, when the closing of the frontier. So like, what's that film with Leonardo DiCaprio where he fights a bear, The Revenant?
Revenant.
Yeah, where I think that's like the time period it's set in is like right when the frontier is closing, and
I'm thinking
America's
also
kind of
about that Christian Bale and Rosamund Pike one, Hostiles. It's also the same.
Yes.
In the moment of
but I guess it's, and so but I guess what is that trying to address? Is it is it literally the closing of the frontier, that, you know, it's nearly 150 years afterwards and America's still not over it? Or is it rather that, you know, it's the closing of the other frontier, the end of history? Is it a way of America sort of unconsciously dealing with that? I kind of think that's more likely. But then you kind of come back to the 2000s again, right? So I guess that you have the end of history, you have 9/11, you have these kind of this one great victory, and then like a decade later, you know, the America winning quotation marks the Cold War, and then 10 years later, the mass humiliation and trauma of 9/11. And when I think about American psychedelia, personally, I don't really think about acid trips and the Summer of Love, because I mean, that's not I wasn't alive then, so it's kind of just a memory for me. But the American psychedelia that I remember was like the mid 2000s bands like Animal Collective, or I don't know, there was like that kind of freak folk era. I kind of think Joanna Newsom's maybe in there. This sort of it's like a return to like naivety almost. It was like a kind of noisy, almost like childlike fascination with musical production. And that relates, I think, to this kind of issue with American culture almost, where I think I mentioned this in Egress, where there's the American literary critic, Leslie Fiedler, often makes the point that, you know, early American literary classics, they're essentially children's stories or coming of age stories. Like Tom Sawyer is a children's story, effectively. But because America itself was a child, I don't mean that in a sort of patronizing way, but, you know, American culture seemed to relish the youth of its own, you know, its youth as a nation state. It kind of had its own adolescence when most of Europe was, you know, centuries established as kind of, you know, these borders were been there for a long, long time. And so America post 9/11 like has this desire to return to innocence, I think, which wasn't really possible. So what was at that time held up as like the American avant-garde of a lot of these noisy bands that were sort of channeling a kind of new psychedelia, I think in hindsight was kind of a cultural regression. It wasn't really dealing with the present because the present was awful. Post 9/11 America was obviously a miserable place. I mean, it was a miserable place even, I think, outside of America. It was kind of a very dark place to be. So the persistent, you know, and I think that's the side of psychedelia that Mark always hated. He didn't he hated the persistent association with like an infantilism, with childishness, and that I think the issue with a lot of psychedelic stuff now is that we still haven't left that behind. And I often wonder, you know, how much of current psychedelic resurgence isn't just kind of the continuation of that, you know, mid 2000s moment. I think for Mark, and this is kind of something that mentioned in the post-capitalist desire introduction, I think Mark understood psychedelia quite literally. So psyche, I guess, it means mind. Delia, or from the Greek delos, which I think is notably also the name of the corporation in Westworld, means to manifest. So psychedelia is literally making manifest what is in the mind, making your dreams come true, essentially, or I guess if at the basic level, just hallucinating. But I think what Mark saw in there was something a bit more that had a bit more agency, like Marx's adage that the point's not to interpret the world but to change it. We can, you know, I think that's the sort of new potential for psychedelia in popular culture that he saw. Not this cultural regression going back to childhood and innocence, but actually the making what the ideal that you have in your mind, making that, doing what you can to make that come true. Which I think it was just a call to arms for socialists and communists the world over. You know, it's time we need to put our money where our mouth is, and culturally, psychedelia could be one way to do that, but not this kind of inert version that we've still got. And yeah, I mean, the people that I see actively pushing for a resurgent psychedelic kind of cultural moment, it's very recognizable, and I don't think it has that kind of self-awareness. So I think about your question a lot, but it's still kind of an open one. You know, whether it's what that will amount to, I think, Still kind of an open question, but I think it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, we're running out of time, so I'm going to
sorry, I'm a rambler.
But I would like to conclude asking what's next for Matt Colquhoun. You keep consistently blogging about present events. You host the podcast Bodies Without Organs, which is about the Deleuze and Guattari's work, and you have declared recently that you're working in a book on narcissism, if I'm not wrong. So what can we expect from you in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I'm finishing the next book really soon. I'm hoping it'll be done by the end of the year. It's called Narcissus in Bloom. It will probably come out about a year whenever I finished it. It very much depends on when I finish it at the moment. Yeah, I guess it's an attempt to provide a sort of short counter history of the selfie or the self-portrait, not as a symptom of like a pathological narcissism, but well, I guess related to the psychedelic stuff. It's as a symbol of cultural of change and transition, essentially. Like the tale of Narcissus itself was always about self-overcoming. Modern retellings are always about how Narcissus drowns in his own reflection because he's just obsessed with himself and distracted by himself. But the original tale was always, the moment where Narcissus dies comes from him being desperate to break, escape his own reflection of himself. And I kind of wonder, the book basically asks the question of, how we kind of use the pathological diagnosis of narcissism to kind of shut down that kind of project. So you see Black Lives Matter, climate change activists, people fighting for trans rights, always being dismissed as suffering from collective narcissism. But I think the point maybe is rather that if we are filled with self-concern, that concern is warranted, and it's driven by a desire for the new, for new selves and new worlds. I'm really excited about the book, and it's kind of interesting to try and be finishing it now. Whilst I know a lot of people are going to be reading Egress again for the first time, but I think it's kind of an argument that maybe still resonates with that book. Precisely because, I mean, Egress is written essentially in the first person, but it strives for a kind of self-overcoming and a dissolution of a melancholic self into the joy of community. And it's kind of funny because for a long time I thought these two projects were going to be totally unrelated. This is going to be like maybe a break from writing about Mark Fisher, a way to turn away from that and do something completely new. And I think I've learned actually in sort of preparing to talk to you today that a lot of my work, past, present, and probably future, constitutes variations on that theme. That is, overcoming the self, individualism, ego, or at least using the self as a platform for diving into solidarity with others, and kind of analyzing the ways that contemporary capitalist society often thwarts our various attempts to actually embrace that part of our humanity. So that's a thread in Mark's work as well, of course, and I think it's my favorite thread in his work. And working with it's kind of allowed that to be crystallized as a question, I suppose. Yeah, if you're into that, then I reckon I'll have plenty more to say on it in the future, and probably for a long time to come.
So yeah, I can wait to read it, and of course we can repeat the conversation anytime you want. And we can do it about the next book, which I'm different. Now I'm more interested even in reading. So Matt, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to us. It was a pleasure. Best of luck in the new book and also the publication of Egreso in Spanish, which is happening. In a few months, let's say in the first quarter or first months of 2022. Thanks a lot, Matt. It was a pleasure having you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.